Welcome back, everybody. For you to do now, you're practicing your summarizing skills. If you could wrap up a lot of the stuff we talked about yesterday into a few sentences, what was life like as a Vietnam War soldier? Obviously, you're going to have to talk about how it was very challenging, very difficult. A lot of directions you could go. You could talk about the environment being a big challenge, the jungle, the disease. You could talk about the enemy being difficult to find, that they were using tactics that were hard to fight against. You talk about how Vietnam soldiers didn't want to be there. A lot of combat days. A lot of them were drafted. You could talk about how they were treated when they got home. Lots of ways to go. Whereas a lot of these soldiers were just not happy. Right? They were doing a very difficult, challenging life, and which is why a lot of them struggled once coming home. Today, we're going to look at how Americans reacted to the Vietnam War, sort of the protests and why it was so divisive among Americans. So, initially, most Americans are all for this. Right? Americans ready to go to war. We're going to prove it stick it to the communists. We got to help our allies. All these good reasons for going to war. Americans were behind it. But after a couple of years, people start to realize a lot of the flaws in this war. It's like, why are we fighting for Vietnam? Why are we having these huge death tolls? Why are we drafting soldiers to go do this? What are we doing there? What's the goal? Who are we trying to fight against? How do we win the war? Right? There wasn't this idea of we need to conquer and win. It was we need to defend. Right? And that's hard to do. Um, and Americans were starting to realize this wasn't like World War II or Korea. The enemy they fighting wasn't the same, and they started to turn. They started to not want to fight this war, and there'd be large scale protests against the war. And it's going to get really big, and it's going to come from some very specific areas within the U.S. population. There's a couple of things we need to note about this. Vietnam's going to be the first war where a lot of the stuff is going to be televised, where people can see stuff, not live, but they can see actual footage of the war. Right? You got to see some of that yesterday. You don't have that same amount of footage for World War II or Korea. You didn't see live action, whereas now you can. And this is going to turn a lot of people. Plus, the news reports on stuff daily, and every day it was just more bad news about the Americans dying. There was no good news. You could never say, "Ooh, we made it. We won this huge battle, and now we're advancing closer to our goal." It was just, we're still defending. More guys are dying. There was never good news. It was only bad. I said a lot of people questioning, like, what's the goal? What's the purpose? Um, a lot of the people who are going to start the protest are going to be young 18 to 25-year-olds, 21-year-olds who are, a lot of times they're college students, but not always. And they're protesting against the draft. And that's where a lot of this is going to start, is that you shouldn't be drafting people to fight a war. And this is going to expand to this idea that, why are we fighting this war at all? Why should anybody be going to this war? A lot of the arguments they made is like, I'm drafted at 18, and at this time you had to be 21 to vote. So they said, I'm drafted and I'm going to fight a war. I don't even get to vote. How does that make sense? One of the outcomes of this is the voting age is going to be turned down to 18. This movement of like protest against the government is going to get wrapped up with the civil rights movement and women's rights movement. So there's going to be a lot of protests going on in the late 60s that's about all three of these things. It's going to get very complicated, but there's going to be a lot of people who are doing all these protests at once. Here's some examples of protesters protesting against the president. His name was Johnson at the time, calling him a war criminal, accusing him of killing innocent people, starting an unjustified war, right? Get the hell out of Vietnam, end the war. Right? These are examples. And these are thousands of people every day. These aren't like protests today, which usually last like one day, and people go back with their lives. These were happening every single day. Right? Widespread protests. We're going to watch a video about the protesters to understand what was going on. You can pause this video while you watch. As this goes on and the war's not ending, the protests get bigger and bigger, and the conflict between the pro-war and the anti-war people gets bigger and bigger. It's more violent and divisive. People start fighting. There's a lot of hatred. Americans are really sort of like ripped apart by this war. Um, People fight each other. People are fighting the police. People are fighting the military. There are people who are refusing to be drafted, who are moving to Canada to avoid it. A lot of conflict. There's one particular protest that is very symbolic of this. Kind of shows a lot of it. Is at a college called Kent State, which is in Ohio. You have a lot of people out protesting against the war, and they're getting a little unruly, throwing rocks, disturbing people. So they call in the police. Things get escalated. They call in the National Guard, and then it gets really confusing because no one really knows what happened. Um, some people accuse the protesters of throwing stuff, but what we know happens is that the National Guard starts firing, starts shooting at the protesters, and kills several of them. Right, and you think about who we are as a country and what we stand for about freedom of speech and the right to protest. We don't kill our own people. That's what communism does. That's what the Soviet Union does. Yet here we have an example of the US military killing Americans for protesting. And this is a very bad look for the United States. And a lot of people who are on the fence are like, oh, you know what, this war is just not worth it. It's ripping our country apart for what? For Vietnam, a country most people don't know about? For people who don't want us there? For a war that's unwinnable? Why are we doing this? And these huge protests are going to be successful. Eventually, the war will come to an end, and America is going to end it earlier than a lot of the soldier or the generals would like because of these protests. So again, we'll watch a video on the Kent State protests. You can pause this one. What we're going to do today is analyze some photos of Vietnam War protesters. The assignment will be in Schoology. We'll be in week 6, Thursday, Vietnam protests. Once you get the assignment open, we'll have different photos on the left and questions to answer on the right. One of the big things I'm asking you, like in this one, is to make an inference. To make an inference means to make an educated guess. Based on what you know, make a prediction. Make a prediction about one of these soldiers. What are they thinking? What are they doing? What's about to happen? Like, make some predictions that you don't know if it's right or wrong, but you're making an educated guess. All right, so there's several pictures to analyze. And when you're done, be sure to click submit.